A significant strain is being placed on the New Zealand Cook Islands relationship over concerns about the island nation's transparency as an agreement with China draws near.
New Zealand and Kiribati currently engaged in diplomatic disputes over foreign aid and Kiribati's ties to China.
New Zealand's foreign minister announced a rethink of more than 100 million New Zealand dollars in development support after Kiribati President Tanis Mamau withdrew from a meeting a week before a planned visit.
Rifts between New Zealand and two of our Pacific neighbours have been bubbling away for the last few weeks. And in the background, this.
President Trump says he wants USAID, the relief agency helping millions of people around the world, to be shut down.
Pacific aid experts are monitoring developments in the US as the government makes moves to shut down US Aid Agency for International Development.
The thread that ties all this together: fears that China will fill the vacuum left by the US.
What we're seeing right now with the Trump administration over the last week is just very clearly an American retreat when it comes to the rest of the world. Handing this over, like China doesn't even need to fight for their influence around the world now because of our own effort. We're doing China's work for them.
And what does that mean for us?
New Zealand will have to work very hard in order to be able to maintain its significance in the Pacific.
Kia ora, I'm Gwen McClure, and on The Detail today, geopolitical games in the South Pacific. Let's start with what's happening with the Cook Islands and Kiribati. This is Sam Sachdeva, who covers foreign affairs for Newsroom.
The first story to come out from Barbara Drever at One News, who actually broke both of these, was around Kiribati and the fact that New Zealand has decided to review our aid program to Kiribati after Winston Peters was planning a trip there, was meant to be meeting with their Prime Minister, who's also the Foreign Minister, and at the last minute was told, oh no, sorry, he's not available to meet you. So that sounds like this has been an ongoing issue. You know, we've spent months, the government spent months trying to arrange a trip to engage with them, and have found it really difficult. And also, by all accounts, we're not the only country to find that this is a problem, that Kiribati is getting increasingly walled off, shuttered off, and perhaps coincidentally, perhaps not, has been forming a closer relationship with China in recent years. A decision to review our entire aid program is quite a big move, and that suggests that we're not taking it lightly. The other story that we've seen is in relation to the Cook Islands. So you've got their Prime Minister Mark Brown heading to Beijing this week to sign a comprehensive partnership agreement with China. The reason it's of concern to us is because we have a unique relationship with the Cook Islands. They're sort of in free association, so they have freedom to set their own foreign policy and other initiatives, but they do also have an obligation to consult with us as a former territory. So there's been a bit of debate over, well, have the Cook Islands done everything they can or should to tell us about what is in this agreement with China? Mark Brown says yes, we've done what we need to, and that's that. Whereas Winston Peters and the government here are saying, well, no, we don't actually think you fulfilled your requirements. So, we don't know exactly what's in that deal still and what it will mean. But there's another example where, China's relations in the Pacific are causing concern for us and leading us to feel like we're perhaps being left out of the loop.
We'll come back to Sam. Jonathan Milne is managing editor of Newsroom and used to be editor of the Cook Island News. He says these diplomatic dramas are not new.
Look, I think we can go back to the Obama administration in the States and see how there's been an emerging tussle for the Pacific and for toeholds in the Pacific between the US and China. The difficulty for the USA is that it's been pretty absent from the Pacific, or from the South Pacific anyway, since World War II. It's really been 10, 20 years where China has slowly been building relations in the Pacific with its Belt and Road Development Project, has been supporting the building of infrastructure with some donations and a lot of loans. And meanwhile, the US was really caught on the back foot, and it suddenly realised how much influence China was winning. So this is not new. In 2018, I remember writing at the Sunday Star Times, and this was when Winston Peters was previously Foreign Affairs Minister, writing about his outrage at being blindsided, as he said, by Cook Islands and Niue when they quietly signed up to China's Belt and Road Infrastructure Initiative. Very similar he purported to be angry that they'd done it without consultation, but I think much of the anger was that they'd done it at all. There's a degree of New Zealand colonialism or imperialism in the Pacific. I think New Zealand governments like to think that in exchange for some community and aid support and development support, they are entitled to get the final word on important issues like how these nations vote in international fora and what their stand is in foreign policy. And rightly enough, I think these countries are saying, well, we do have a degree of independence here that we're entitled to exercise.
Maybe it's me as a foreigner, but I'm not sure I understand what New Zealand gets out of this relationship.
I think what New Zealand gets is some of the same things that the US and China have looked for out of the relationship, which is a physical toehold in the Pacific in an increasingly geostrategically important part of the world, where there's important fisheries, there's important shipping lanes, and there's important law and order imperatives. I mean, being able to keep an eye, for instance, on the drug trade between Asia and Australia and South America is pretty important through that part of the world. So geostrategically, geopolitically, it's important. The special relationship that New Zealand and Cook Islands have means that in some fora, like the United Nations, New Zealand casts the Cook Islands vote for it where it does have a vote. In other fora, the Cook Islands is independently represented. It has its own representatives there, but it's expected to work pretty closely alongside New Zealand. So this is pretty useful to New Zealand in that respect. What does Cook Islands get out of it is the next question I get, and clearly it's a country that's very small. I mean, by my estimate, maybe as few as 12,000 people, certainly during COVID. And it just doesn't have the economies of scale. It doesn't have an army. It can't have an army. It doesn't. It doesn't have its own sort of helicopters and Orions or Hercules to patrol the ocean. So it does need New Zealand's support. There's a bilateral relationship which allows Cook Islanders who need secondary or tertiary hospital care to be flown to New Zealand. So there's a lot in it for them as well. But it still bridles a little bit, not that they have a relationship with New Zealand, but that New Zealand takes that relationship for granted.
That strain has played out in public, with the tiff between Winston Peters and the Cook Islands PM, Mark Brown, over both a proposal for Cook Islanders to have their own passports and because Brown is in Beijing this week signing a deal. It's likely not a coincidence it's happening at the same time US aid is closing down offices around the world.
China would be watching and hoping that there'll be more space for its intervention in the Pacific. And certainly that's what we're going to see in the future with more Chinese engagement in the Pacific, particularly at a time when the US engagement is beginning to thin out.
Distinguished Professor Steve Ratuba is director of the Macmillan Brown Center for Pacific Studies at Canterbury University.
At the time of Biden was able to engage in a significant way, particularly by inviting the Pacific leaders to go to Washington and sign a U.S.-Pacific agreement. But of course, the money which was promised, $800 million for 10 years, hasn't come in. And now, of course, they can forget about it. So all those false promises has given the United States a very, very bad name in the Pacific. So when China does the opposite, it promises and it delivers. So you're going to see that playing out in the next few years. China is going to have the edge over the United States, given the fact that Trump is withdrawing from everywhere, including withdrawal of US aid. One of the reasons why US aid was set up in the first place was really as part of the Cold War contestation between the United States and the Soviet Union. And it was also around the time when the Peace Corps volunteers were set up by Kennedy. So it was a way in which the United States wanted to use soft power, either through education, using the Peace Corps, or through economic means and community engagement through US aid, as a way of keeping the Soviet Union out. So apart from the the economic and social engagement, behind US aid. There's also the political and ideological aspect to it.
So which countries will suffer the most when US aid leaves?
Perhaps the biggest losers will be the former American colonies up in Micronesia, because they have significant amount of aid which they receive from the United States through US aid, and they are going to be feeling the brunt of what's happened.
Here's Newsroom Sam Sachdeva again.
If you look at it in bilateral terms, the US is not necessarily huge. So it's around about the fifth largest donor over the last 15 years or so, I believe. So it's behind Australia, behind Japan, and I think narrowly behind New Zealand, and sort of neck and neck with China. It depends what time frame you look at. But that's still a lot of money, right? We're talking billions of dollars. So, comparatively maybe not huge, but in and of itself, a reasonable amount of money, especially in sort of places where they don't have a lot of funds for things like health initiatives, climate change initiatives, and so on.
So obviously this is going to have a bad impact on Pacific countries receiving this aid, but it's not just about that, right? I mean, there's a real security concern. Can you talk to me about that?
Yeah, so this has sort of been on the radar for a while now. There's a sort of great power competition is one phrase for it. Strategic competition, I think, is the official New Zealand phrase that we use, which is, these superpowers, the US and increasingly China jockeying for power in the Pacific. You've had China investing a lot more resources, open new embassies there. And part of that is they're ramping up their own aid program. So they've been putting a lot into infrastructure projects, providing loans a lot of the time, more than grants, which brings some concerns in terms of debt trap diplomacy. So there's this sort of strategic competition thing sitting over the top of it. And as you say, it's the aid is obviously the main thing, and that's the important thing, but there is this sort of security component sitting underneath, which is giving countries like New Zealand, pause for concern.
What is it that China wants in the Pacific?
Great question. I think there's a number of different answers. Resources are a big one. Obviously, you've got a country of, I think it's 1.4 billion people or something close to that. So they need to be fed. They need, wood, fishery stocks, other things like that. So there's that element of it. And then part of it is just sort of building a base of support, really. If you go to bodies like the United Nations, the vote of Kiribati or the Solomon Islands counts just as much as the, perhaps not the United States because they have a veto, but any of the non-permanent members on the Security Council. So if you can, invest a bit of money, provide aid, a bit of support, then you might gain support in some of those areas. And that's not a wrong thing to do per se. I mean, that's part of what the US and New Zealand and others do, is they try and build influence through aid programs. But it goes into that question of values, I think, is how our government and others would refer to it, is, if you've got China building influence and they have different ways that they want the international order to operate, will that fit with what has been good for us in recent decades?
Can you tell me a bit about those values and what their strategic goals are?
I mean, in terms of how China wants to see the world order, it really depends who you talk to, obviously. I think part of it is they are trying to secure a bit of defensive space for themselves. So, build an alliance to say, hey, we should have the freedom to do what we want within our own country, and so should other countries. So things like, freedom of speech, freedom of expression, freedom of the internet, and things like that. That's where they probably start to take different views from what we would do in New Zealand. Obviously, there's a lot of censorship there and so on. The Great Firewall, as it's referred to. So it's kind of building support in that space to say, look, give us the freedom to do what we want, and we'll leave you alone. But I guess the flip side of that is, some say we need these global values, these shared interests, and the rules-based order is how it's often referred to. And if you end up in a situation where you've got the largest countries domineering over the others, then obviously for a small country like New Zealand, that's a great concern.
Are there other countries that may be moving in to fill this vacuum, or is China the primary concern?
I think China is the biggest player just by sheer virtue of scale, the amount of money that they have to spend. But there will be other smaller players that are around. I think Russia has had a little bit to do with the Pacific. Obviously, they've got other issues that they're dealing with at the moment. But the Pacific is an increasingly busy area. And if you look at this as not so much perhaps non-democratic actors, but the US has been doing more. The UK has opened new embassies. You've got France, which has connections to the Pacific through New Caledonia. They're doing more. So there are a bunch of countries in there. It's not just China and the US and New Zealand. There are increasing amounts of resource and diplomatic staff going into the region.
How is the New Zealand government reacting to this?
They've been pretty quiet so far, and I think part of that is it's not entirely clear what the effects are for New Zealand aid organisations who work in the Pacific. So I got some comment from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade, which said, look, the US is an important partner of ours, but it's up to them to decide what they do with their development program, and we're talking to the organisations we work with to see what the effect is. I think part of it is it's just too soon to say. I think there will be concern about what this could mean, particularly if this 90-day freeze turns into something more permanent, which it seems like it may well do, given the efforts to dismantle US aid. But there's probably an element of wanting to hold off and see what happens, and also not get into a war of words with Donald Trump and his people, because that could be counterproductive in the end.
Does it seem like the kind of thing that could back New Zealand into a corner? And basically make New Zealand kind of decide between an allyship with the US and one with China?
It certainly won't help in terms of the sort of the fine line that we walk when it comes to the US and China. Some of the people I've talked to have made the point, and I've seen it said elsewhere, is that, we talk a good game in the Pacific, that we are, good friends with Pacific nations, and we want to do what's in their interests. So when we have a close partner like the US that's making decisions like this, how willing are we to stand up to them and try and intervene? And if we don't, what does that mean? And, can we then be critical of China and their investments and their aid into the Pacific when you've got the US withdrawing? So, it's not a great position for us to be in, slightly awkward, slightly inconvenient. But that's a line that we've been walking for a while. So I think it's just going to continue to get a little bit trickier, but we're relatively used to it by this point.
What does this mean for New Zealand's spending in the Pacific?
Yeah, look, I think there's going to be a fair amount of pressure on the New Zealand government to increase its own aid spend. That was mentioned in the letter from those aid agencies that went to the Prime Minister. We actually saw cuts in the budget last year for aid, which is quite unusual for New Zealand. Quite small cuts, but still going backwards rather than forwards at a time of quite significant need. We've had this aid review that has been going for some time. I think that's been finished, in fact, and I reported on that late last year. The suggestion seemed to be that we were doing too much, doing too many projects. So we might see further cuts in some areas. That might not mean that our overall dollar spend goes down, but that we are not doing as much around the place. So, look, I think there's going to be a lot of attention paid to the budget this year, and whether or not we can find more money, because if the US withdraws its funding and we can't put in our own money, then countries like China may well look to fill the gap, and that could be of longer term concern to us.
And if there is a gap, can we really blame Pacific Island countries for turning to China? Back to Jonathan Milne.
I think it's understandable that they look to partners who can support them to, economically and with personnel, and who are constant, who are there last year and this year and next year, who aren't just sort of fly in, fly out diplomats who, swing in when it suits them, when it suits their interests. And right now, it really does look like all of the United States relationships in the Pacific are somewhat self-serving when they need something from the Pacific. And I'm sure there's a large degree to which that's true of China as well, but it's not so overt. It's not such a roller coaster ride as it is with the States and with the States' partners. I think what we need to understand is that just as some people in New Zealand might see the Cook Islands as acting as a pawn of China, so too in this matter, New Zealand needs to be considering that it's acting as a proxy for a far more volatile regime for the Trump administration. I mean, we are not the principal in this. We are just another of the pawns in this geostrategic tussle between China and the US.
The underlying theme of all these stories is a fear of China replacing US influence in the Pacific. Do you think there's some xenophobia here?
A few years ago, I would have said that a lot of the attitudes to China were based in xenophobia or were heavily influenced by xenophobia. A lot of the attitudes we saw in the Pacific, a lot of the attitudes we saw in New Zealand. I think in the recent years, some of the human rights abuses and flouting of democratic norms that we've seen in China, Xinjiang and in Hong Kong, have made it a lot harder to defend close relations with China. But at the same time, I would say the volatility we're currently seeing in domestic and international politics from the United States is making that very difficult as well. And what I would say is that there's a degree of certainty and predictability about dealing with China. And we don't like some of their democratic principles or stances. We don't like some of their human rights actions, but we do know how to have a conversation about it, and we do know that they'll be relatively consistent and they'll make plans over a long period and won't flip-flop. Clearly, that's not the case with the new Trump administration. The foreign policy that's announced at 4 a.m. by the president on Truth Social may have changed by the 9 a.m. White House briefing. The whole world is in a spin at present as we try to work out exactly what the Trump administration will do beyond its own borders. So that's going to make the US really hard to deal with. And I think some of us would take the view that some of the Trump policies do impinge on human rights, both within the United States and further afield. So I think it becomes a more difficult conversation around who has the moral high ground. I don't think it's that simple anymore. I don't think the United States is the upholder of democratic principles for the world anymore. And if that's the case, if both of them are deeply flawed on human rights and adherence to basic democracy, then perhaps it comes down to which is more reliable and easier to deal with and who will stick to their word. And on that front, it's probably China.
That's all for today. The Detail is a Newsroom production supported by RNZ and New Zealand On Air. Thank you to Steve Ratuba, Sam Sachdeva, and Jonathan Milne. This episode was produced by Alexia Russell and Davina Zimmer and engineered by Jeremy Veal. I'm Gwen McClure, Mā te wā.